Welcome back to Preparing for the Unexpected. Today we're talking with Dr. Keith Bellizzi, author of Falling Forward. Dr. Keith, great first and second segment there. Now I'd like to talk about something else that you have mentioned in your book. And I think this is a great quote. We create ripples that can touch lives we may never know we've influenced. What do you mean by that comment?
Yeah. You know, we've, I've become increasingly aware that our actions often, have consequences beyond what we can see. Just the fact that you and I are talking today is one example of that. But, think about a kind word, an act of generosity, a moment of encouragement. Those things can affect someone in ways we may never fully understand. I think most of us can underestimate our influence because we focus on immediate results. But human lives, we are all interconnected. We are all interconnected, and we all leave traces behind. So the question isn't whether we create ripples. I think the question is what kind of ripples are we creating, or do we want to create? And I think just sometimes simply by sharing our struggles gives someone else permission to share theirs. And you never know that your story, you may never know that your story was exactly what they needed to hear that day. But after I published Falling Forward, I have received the most touching emails from individuals all over the world: Japan, Australia, Europe, and people I don't know. And they were just touched by something that they read in this book. And that's kind of what I mean by you never really know the ripples that you will create in life. So the question is, what do you want those ripples to look like?
Hmm. This is like reminds me of that expression, no man or no person is an island. We're all interrelated one way or another. And something a good or bad deed is going to affect not just directly, the person beside me, but it can go beyond that, right?
Absolutely. I remember, and I wrote about this one story in my book. My dad and I used to meet at a local breakfast spot in our town, and we would show up there, and there was a homeless man who would be out front, looking for change, and my dad would always reach into his pocket and give him not a lot of money, whatever he had, a couple of dollars. Sometimes after breakfast, we would bring out a breakfast sandwich for him. And then one day we returned and he was gone. Um, we asked the owner of the restaurant, and apparently some of the patrons complained that there was a homeless person out there, begging for money. So they asked him, the police came and asked him to leave. Well, this was one particular day. It was in the middle of August. It was extremely hot out. My father came that morning when we realized he was no longer there with sunblock because it was so hot out that he didn't want him to burn. So we drove around the area and ended up finding him outside of a convenience store. And my father handed him the sunblock, and the expression on his face, like no one has ever done that
Mm.
for him, according to him. And you just saw his face light up in the gratitude that he expressed because someone cared about him enough to go look for him because he was no longer in the spot that we would typically see him at. So, that's just an example of, an act of kindness, an act of generosity that created ripples, created ripples that helped that helped this, this individual who's clearly, struggling in life.
Yeah, and it lets people know that I'm seen. I'm not alone. Even if, the homeless person stays homeless, they
Right.
know they're not alone now, that
A-
they've been seen, that someone cares, like you said.
Absolutely. So, those are the types of things that I was kind of referring to as I was writing that piece in the book.
It's kind of like decisions made in organizations or within communities. The decision is made in a room somewhere, but it has far-reaching impacts to people on the other side of the world, depending on why that decision is. It's those ripples. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. But whatever decision is made, whatever action is taken, will have an impact either positively or negatively on someone else somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I mean, you use the word, we're all interconnected, and that's true. I mean, we are all interconnected, not just within, our homes, our communities, but globally. We really are globally interconnected.
Yeah. The last thing I'd like to touch on is you talk about toxic positivity. That just seems so opposite. What
Yeah.
did you mean by that?
Yeah. So, I think it's really important to be positive, so and to be optimistic in life, because it does certainly influence our behaviors, right? So if you're positive and optimistic, you're more likely to take care of yourself. But what I mean by toxic positivity is the belief that we should stay positive no matter what. It sounds helpful, but it actually can be harmful, because it dismisses legitimate pain. It dismisses legitimate suffering. Telling someone who just lost a loved one, um, like time will heal your pain. That's not helpful. Or telling someone to look on the bright side after they experience some sort of adverse event. That you talked about feeling seen, right? So that could make someone feel unseen or alone, because they don't understand. And when we think about positivity and toxic positivity within the context of resilience, which is how I write about it in the book, it isn't about denying difficult emotions. It's about acknowledging your reality, while also maintaining hope. You can be hopeful and hurting at the same time, right? And it's to be open to the range of emotions. No emotion is bad. Even if you're sad, upset, afraid, they're emotions. Emotions aren't good or bad. And I'll give you an example. My father was the eternal optimist. And when I was going through my cancer experience, my father was the one who would always tell me to stay positive. And I would hear it over and over and over. And finally, I had to stop him. I stopped him at one point and I said, Dad, please stop. I am 24 years old. I was diagnosed with cancer. I'm upset. I'm scared. I have a lot of uncertainty. At times, I'm depressed, and that's okay. I'm 24, and I was told I have a 50-50 chance of survival. So stop telling me to be positive all the time. I don't want to get stuck in a place of negativity. I don't want to get stuck in a place of, depression or sadness. And I never really was. And if I was, then obviously you would want to get some help to kind of get out of that hole. But it's okay to feel sad. And I had to tell my father that, because that just annoyed me as a 24-year-old. It just annoyed me that he wanted me to be positive all the time, when what I was going through wasn't necessarily a positive experience.
Yeah.
you know and come to find out that it was his coping mechanism. It was how he coped with my illness. he had to stay positive. Um, and then that was an extra burden on me because then I felt like when I was around my father, I had to stay positive for him. So it just that's the type of toxic positivity that I was trying to speak about in the book. Being positive is important. I'm not dismissing being positive or an optimist. Just being positive all the time isn't that helpful.
It got me thinking, it could give you a myopic view on things like a horse with blinders. You can only see one thing and you're not being open to the reality around you.
Right, right. And that's really the key to resilience. Oftentimes people think of vulnerability or being vulnerable as a sign of weakness. And in the book, I argue it's the exact opposite. It's actually the starting point. It's where resilience is forged. It's recognizing the totality of your experience and then figuring out how to move forward from there. And if you don't recognize the totality of your experience and recognize all of the emotions, it's a lot harder to do.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect spot to end this segment, but I'd like to see if there's any final thoughts you'd like to share with us about resilience and your research.
Yeah. So I'll just say that, I wrote this book um, for anyone facing adversity. So, whether it's illness, loss of a loved one, a career setback, or, just someone interested in kind of learning skills for the future, because we're all going to be exposed at some point to adverse life events. So, my hope is that readers come away with practical, science-based tools to help navigate, difficult times and find meaning and growth along the way.
Well, thank you so much. Congratulations on the book. It is a good read, and as I say, it probably doesn't show very well, but there's a lot of dog-eared pages in here. So great stuff. And I'm so glad you shared your story about your cancer diagnosis and that all these years later, you're here right with me today to share this experience with myself and with others. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. I really enjoyed talking with you today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Till next time.